I'm going to ask and call for public testimony out of order, and I'm going to ask Ms. Carol Wick, who's representing herself, to come up and testify. Ms. Wick, you are recognized. Make sure that your microphone is on, please.
Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, thank you for inviting me to address the committee concerning the egregious misuse of public funds by the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence. My name is Carol Wick, and I come today before you to share my background, my perspective, and provide you with helpful context for this scandal. I've worked in the nonprofit field my entire 30-year career, first as a licensed trauma therapist for abused children, and later as a CEO of a certified Florida Domestic Violence Center. I currently own an international consulting firm that helps build the capacity of nonprofits around the globe, and this year I've been honored to work with courageous rape survivors on House Bill 199, Donna's Law, and I'm enormously grateful to those of you in this room who have played a key role because we were almost there. I'd also like to thank Representative Scott Plakin. When I approached him with a stack of documents and charts several inches thick this summer, I wasn't sure how I would be received. I'd hit so many roadblocks along the way. It means a great deal that he got us in front of you today. And I'd also like to recognize my fellow advocates who heroically fight domestic violence on the front lines. I've always believed there is no more dedicated individual than a domestic violence advocate, and there are many of them here today. Between 2006 and 2016, I served as the CEO of Harbor House of Central Florida. In that role, I had the privilege of working with some of the most amazing advocates, both in our agency and in our community, who fought every day to keep women, men, and families safe. It's the hardest job I've ever had, but also the most fulfilling. Part of what made it so exciting was the collaborating with advocates around the globe to bring best practices back to our community. The idea that we could save just one life is what drove me. Together, we were able to replicate best practices, publish research, pass legislation, and in 2016, my last year at Harbor House, we were able to eliminate domestic violence homicides at the city of Orlando. Despite our success, we encountered roadblock after roadblock working within the system created by Tiffany Carr and the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which was fraught with favoritism, retaliation, and we now know corruption. I watched in horror as FCADV became more and more controlling, threatening, and abusive to those who dared question how things were being run or how the money was being spent. Survivors were a means to keep policymakers in line. If you dared challenge them, you were labeled anti-woman. Funding became a means to keep centers from blowing the whistle. Step out of line, ask too many questions, and your funding or even your career were at risk, which I would find out the hard way almost 4 years ago to this day. As I've made clear through my numerous conversations and documents I've shared with the media, elected officials, and the Inspector General's office over the last few years, the truth must come out. What Tiffany Carr, her board, and her senior staff did with millions of taxpayers' dollars is a serious betrayal of public trust. That said, there's a human element to what happened here that's even more catastrophic than you may realize. Tiffany Carr and those in league with her destroyed lives, careers, and endangered countless women, children, and men. When a survivor comes into shelter, they have no idea what's on the other side of the door that they're about to open, only that walking through it may well mean their life. When they take that step, they're leaving everything they know behind and walking into an unknown future, often with no job, no home, perhaps not even a change of clothes or shoes on their feet. They recognize that it means trusting a complete stranger for their life and the lives of their children. Now imagine being sent to those a message being sent to those brave souls, desperate for their freedom, who risked likely their lives to go to that shelter, only to be sent away because there was not enough money to provide resources for them. That was the fate of 47,000 victims in Florida in 2018, according to a study by the National Network to End Domestic Violence. Based on the $4.2 million that Tiffany Carr allegedly took for herself last year, just 3 days of her pay could have funded a domestic violence advocate's entire salary. That's 120 advocates that could have been deployed against this epidemic. It makes me angry just to think of how many lives could have been saved and improved if those advocates had been there to answer the phone, to help with an injunction, or offer support. During the same month that Tiffany Carr was closing on her luxury $1.9 million home in North Carolina, Nicole Montalvo was kidnapped and held at knife point by a man who would eventually kill her. What additional resources have saved her from being murdered and cut into pieces by her ex-husband? Could Cassie Jones and her 4 children have been saved if Carr hadn't been collecting $11,000 a day in funds that were meant to protect them? Whenever I hit another roadblock in my quest to expose their egregious behavior, what provided me with the fuel to keep going was simply bringing it back to the enormous cost her behavior had on the victims of domestic violence. FCADV and its board needs to be held accountable for making a mockery of the laws of the state. During my time running a domestic violence center, I always found it strange that the board of directors was so secretive despite requirements to operate under sunshine laws. As a member center, I couldn't attend a board meeting if I'd wanted to, or even if I'd known where they were held. I once applied to be on the FCADV board and was told by Carr that's not how it works. My center was charged 10% of our budget annually in so-called membership dues, only to find out weeks ago that they didn't have the authority to collect that money. According to documents that I obtained during one of my many public records requests, dues from funds were on top of the administrative fees that FCADV received to administer those fees. So you can imagine my frustration when our center, which was in dire need of capital funds and had been used as the poster child to get the 2013 legislation allocating $10 million, did not receive capital funding. I asked FCADV staff to see our grant score, but was denied. After threatening legal action, I discovered that Sandra Barnett, the coalition's chief operating officer, did not even provide our application to the independent review committee. Thus, it never received a score. To this day, it's unclear how the money was spent or where it was distributed. Through the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence Foundation and other efforts, Tiffany Carr increasingly took control of funds, both public and private sources. Private dollars that had previously gone to local centers were soon controlled by FCADV. Money went into the foundation for lavish galas, but never came back out. Asking questions and demanding change was not tolerated within Carr and the board system. Those who got too close to the answers or who were not sufficiently loyal to Carr were fired and replaced. In 2016, I was one of 3 executive directors that were suddenly fired within 90 days without explanation. And while we were kept at arm's length as member organizations, what I discovered is that survivors were treated with even more disdain. For more than 15 years, taxpayers paid FCADV to interview survivors and gather information to drive decisions around services in Florida. The so-called listening project is highlighted on their website. What would happen is center CEOs would receive a heavily redacted version of this annual report, but no plan was ever developed to address the issues that were raised year after year. I know this because in 2017, I asked through a public records request for a copy of the data, only to discover that all of the research had been destroyed. For the last few years, no reports were even generated. Thousands of voices of survivors, those we pledged to protect, were silenced. Taxpayer money was again thrown away. At night, when I close my eyes, the human fallout of this scandal, the faces, haunt me. In 2018, 215 Floridians lost their lives due to domestic violence. In the first half of 2019, another 91 people lost their lives. Numerous law enforcement officers were injured and several were killed responding to calls. Today I'm asking you not to focus only and think that this is merely about executive compensation and that capping salaries is a solution. The solution is ensuring that the voices of survivors are never silenced again. When a survivor enters a shelter, our first priority is to make them feel safe. And to those that hurt victims, our message is you will be held accountable. For too long, despite the resourcefulness and the heroic work of countless advocates, the system in Florida failed, and it cost tens of thousands of victims of domestic violence their freedom. That needs to end right now. Members, it's up to each of you to send a clear message to survivors wishing to escape their abusers that we are there for them, and to make loud and clear to those that hurt victims that you will be held accountable. I commend the governor for ordering the investigation, the House Speaker, as well as the committee today for their actions. These historic hearings mark a powerful first step. But from here, the hard part begins. Coming up with a comprehensive legislative fix, it's important that the solution be the right one, not the quick and easy one. It's the one that ensures transparent oversight, that finances are public, that executives and boards run these organizations and are held accountable, but most of all, it establishes a system first and foremost where the number one priority is safety of survivors, and that it's open to innovation and the funding of best practices. I look forward to these continued conversations in the weeks to come. The stakes here are enormous. Thousands of people's lives going back years have been put at risk. The power is in your hands to make these rights wrong, or these wrongs rights. Survivors are counting on the people in this room to get it right. In fact, their lives depend on it. Thank you.
Ms. Wick, if you don't mind, members, we do have a brief amount of time left, but I do want to open it up for any questions that you may have of Ms. Wick. Representative Fine, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you. I have one question. First, but let me say thank you for being here today. You know, they could have certainly used a little bit more of your perspective, and this is a day that was generally been awful. You give me a little hope. So the victims are lucky to have you. I have one question. We heard testimony earlier today from Ms. Keith, who claimed that the board and the executive director CEO really had nothing to do with the amount of money that the individual shelters received, that there was some formula, it was all automated, so there was no conflict of interest as a result between being on the board as the head of one of these local facilities and being on the overall board. There was no conflict of interest because there was no flexibility in how the money was distributed. It's a formula. And it sounds like, my question for you is, was that a lie?
That is absolutely not true, at least when I was an executive director. There were numerous grants that were provided that were competitive grants that were distributed by the coalition that were not based on a funding formula, including private dollars that were then taken over by FCADV, taken away from local centers, and then they convinced those private funders to give the money to them to distribute.
I'm going to ask you to go ahead and explain that last point, if you would, please. The private dollars being taken.
Several years ago, the Allstate Foundation, many of us used to apply directly to Allstate. For instance, I had a member on my board that was an employee of Allstate, and the coalition convinced Allstate to give them all the money so that they could distribute it.
Thank you. Representative Good, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair. I, too, really appreciate you being here. It's nice to hear the perspective from a member organization that was not involved in as a board member. So thank you very much for being here.
Well, and you should know I am a private, I have my own company now. I no longer work for a domestic violence center. I'm just a private advocate.
I understand that. But Mike, I would like to ask a question about when you were the executive director. Can you tell us during that time how much funding your organization got from FCADV and what your overall budget was?
Our budget was around a little over $4 million, and I want to say that probably about 60% of that, maybe 70% of that came from the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence and various funds that they administered.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Valdez, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your testimony here today. I asked kind of sort of the same question of the previous executive director, that based on if she were to, as a board member, question anything in reference to the coalition's business activities and salary and things of that nature if they were in fear of being retaliated on? And she said she couldn't answer that question. Can you share your experience, and if you don't mind, about your termination and what was all that about?
Recognized.
I can tell you that I asked lots of questions because that's just my nature, and many times the answers I was told, I don't know, we don't have that information. I asked for organizational charts, I asked for strategic plans. Usually we were just not provided with the information, said that it did not exist. That was usually the answer. There were numerous questions that I had around the compensation study of the CEOs. Someone was making money when I looked at the 990s. I couldn't link the numbers in the compensation study to the 990s. I asked that question of Ms. Barnett, and she told me she would not tell me the information. So I knew there was something going on. I didn't realize how close I was getting. I started calling centers together so we could work together to start to move together collectively, because that was not happening. And all I can tell you is I've never received any issues with my board, any corrective actions. Ms. Carr was having conversations with them. I was suddenly called into a board meeting 10 minutes early, asked to resign with no explanation. And from there, I have never been provided with an explanation after 10 years of an exemplary service. That's all I can say about that.
Thank you for your service and for your testimony, for your advocacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, members. Seeing no further, hold on a second. Representative Toledo, you recognized for a question?
Thank you so much for your testimony. Do you know of any other centers that questioned the CEO that had their funds withheld or similar fates as yourself?
I am not aware of that. We were not encouraged to really discuss funding and who got what, and we really weren't provided. It's not public record, even though they are required to be under sunshine. For instance, you can't find out who received the 2013 capital allocation. It's not available. When DCF administered those funds, it was public record. It's not anymore.
All right, thank you, members. And seeing no further questions, thank you, Ms. Wick. I appreciate your testimony today. All right, members, we are ready now to bring in Ms. Diaz. If we can go ahead and bring her in. If you need to take a quick break, we're going to stay in session here. If you need to take a quick break, do it. Just hustle back.